All right, let's dive into a really fascinating period in early Indian history, from about 600 BCE to 600 CE. This was a time of huge, sweeping changes. We're going to look at the social rule books they wrote to try and make sense of it all, and ask a really simple question. Did any of it actually work? And that's really the big question here, isn't it? When everything's in flux, politically, economically, culturally, how do people even try to create order? What kind of rules do they come up with? Who gets to write them? And, maybe most importantly, does anyone actually follow them? So, let's get our bearings with this timeline. We're talking about a massive 1,200-year stretch of history. It kicks off with new cities and kingdoms popping up. Then you see Brahmana starting to write down these social codes. Before you know it, powerful empires rise, brand new religious ideas challenge everything, and this continues all the way to 600 CE. This is not a static picture, it's a society in constant, dynamic motion. Okay, so to make our way through this complex world, here's our game plan. First, we'll meet our main guide for this journey, the epic Mahabharata. Then we'll check out the ideal rules that society was supposed to live by. After that, and this is the juicy part, we'll look at the massive gap between those rules and what was really happening. And finally, we'll see why this ancient story is, in many ways, still being written today. To really get a feel for the social norms of this time, we need a guide. And our guide is one of the world's truly great epics, the Mahabharata. But it's so much more than just a story. For historians, it's like a window that lets us peer into the values, the conflicts, and the entire structure of ancient Indian society. Now, here's what's absolutely wild about this text. It wasn't written by one person in one go. Nope. Historians figure it was composed, retold, and added to over an incredible 1,000-year period. Just think about that. It means it's not a single snapshot in time. It's more like a movie capturing layers and layers of history, arguments, and changing social norms. And the sheer scale of it is just staggering. We're talking over 100,000 verses. It's colossal. The main story is all about this bitter feud between two sets of cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who are fighting over land and power. And it's right inside this huge family drama that we find all these clues about the social rules of the time. So you might be wondering, how on earth do you study a text this huge and messy? Well, back in 1919, a team of scholars led by V.S. Suktankar took on this monumental task. They went all over India, collected different Sanskrit manuscripts, and compared them verse by verse. This massive project, the Critical Edition, showed two amazing things. First, there was a common central story everywhere. But second, there were tons of regional variations. People were adapting and telling this epic in their own way all across the subcontinent. All right, so let's get into the ideal social order. Using texts like the Mahabharata and legal books called the Dharma Sutras, we can basically piece together the official blueprint for how society was supposed to work, at least according to the Brahminical tradition. At the very heart of both family and kingdom was this idea of patrilineal. It's pretty simple. Everything gets passed down from father to son. The son inherits his dad's property, and if his dad's a king, he inherits the throne. In fact, the entire war in the Mahabharata is basically a giant succession crisis, a bloody, violent fight over who has the legitimate claim to the throne through their father's line. Now, to keep marriage organized, Brahminical texts came up with the Gotra system. Think of it like this. People were sorted into these large family groups, each named after a legendary Vedic sage. The idea was that everyone in a Gotra was related. And this came with two super strict rules. Rule 1, you absolutely had to marry outside of your own Gotra. Rule 2, once a woman got married, she had to give up her father's Gotra and take on her husband's. And that brings us to the big picture of society, the Varna system. According to a foundational myth, the 4 Varnas came from the body of a cosmic, primeval being. From the head came the Brahmanas, the priests and scholars. From the arms, the Kshatriyas, the rulers and warriors. From the thighs, the Vaishyas, who were the farmers and merchants. And from the feet came the Shudras, whose job it was to serve the other 3. This wasn't just a social structure. It was presented as a divine, unchangeable order. And here's a really important detail within this system. The top 3 groups, Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, were called Dvija, or twice born. Their second birth was a special ceremony that gave them an exclusive privilege, the right to study the sacred texts, the Vedas. This created a massive dividing line in society, because Shudras and all women, no matter their Varna, were completely shut out from this sacred knowledge.
Okay, so that was the blueprint, the official rulebook. But here's where things get really, really interesting. Now we're going to pivot to the messy, complicated, and often contradictory world of how people actually lived their lives.
So we've got this neat and tidy set of rules, right? But did people actually follow them? Did society really function as perfectly as these texts claimed it should? Well, all the historical evidence we have points to a pretty clear answer. Not even close. Let's just start at the very top. The rulebook says only kshatriyas can be kings. Simple, right? But when we actually look at the dynasties from this period, the list of non-kshatriya rulers is huge. The famous Mauryan Empire, their origins were debated, maybe even low. The Shungas, Kanvas, and Satavahanas, all brahmanas. The powerful Shakas and Kushanas, they were seen as outsiders or mlikshas. And the Guptas, who led a supposed golden age, they were from the Vaishya Varna. The rule was broken way more often than it was followed. The Satavahana dynasty is just a fantastic example of this rule breaking. These were powerful kings who called themselves brahmanas, yet they just ignored the rules. The rulebook says marry outside your gotra. Some of their queens had the same gotra as the king. The rules say a woman takes her husband's gotra. Their queens kept their father's names. And get this, while they were patrilineal, their kings were famously named after their mothers, like Gautami Putta, which literally means son of Gautami. They were clearly playing by a totally different set of rules. Now, at the other end of the social ladder, for those completely outside the Varna system, life was incredibly harsh. A legal text called the Manusmriti describes a group known as Chandalas, who were considered untouchable. Their duties included handling corpses, and they were forced to live outside the main villages and wear the clothes of the dead. This quote is so stark. It shows how the system wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a tool for brutal social exclusion. But it's so important to remember that the Brahmanical view wasn't the only game in town. There was a powerful alternative coming from Buddhism. Buddhist thinkers looked at the Varna system and completely rejected the idea that it was created by the gods. They said, no, social inequality is a human invention, and if people created it, people can change it. They didn't see kingship as a divine right, but more like a social contract, where people choose a leader to keep things orderly. So where does all this leave us? With all these contradictions, how are we supposed to read a text like the Mahabharata? Well, the key is to stop thinking of it as a static rulebook. We have to see it as a dynamic, living, breathing document.
And what do I mean by a dynamic text? It means the Mahabharata isn't a single photograph of one moment in time. It's much more like a 1,000-year-long film. A society changed, the story itself was retold, and new bits were added that reflected new beliefs, new gods, and even new social conflicts. It holds centuries of arguments and tensions, all within this one epic. Historians have a theory about how this happened in stages. It probably started as an oral hero story, told by bards. Then, from about the 5th century BCE, Brahmanas started writing it down, and they wove their social codes into it. A few centuries later, as the worship of gods like Krishna exploded in popularity, he was written in as a central character. And finally, these long instructional sections on law and morality got added, making the epic the incredibly complex tapestry we know today. And that really brings us to the most important takeaway here. The real value of a text like the Mahabharata isn't just in the rules it spells out. For a historian, its true genius lies in that visible tension, the gap between what the text says should be and all the evidence of what actually was. That messy, complicated space in between, that's where society argues and resists and changes. That's where history is actually made. So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. If even the most sacred texts of a society don't always line up with the reality people lived, what does that teach us about how we should read history today? It's a powerful reminder to always look for the story behind the official story and to always ask, who's writing the rules and for whom?